And I believe next up we have, we're going to move on to our next session within this time slot. And we're going to be talking with Betsy Oliver, who's you've been hearing as the voice behind the scene. But now she's going to get her turn in the limelight, talking about responding to oil spill. Betsy is with the Prince William Sound Regional Citizen Advisory Council doing outreach and education. And again, we thank the Prince William Sound, the Regional Citizen Advisory Council, for being a sponsor of this event. So, Betsy, take it away.
Thanks, Paul. Let me share my screen. All right, yeah, thanks. So I'm Betsy Oliver. I am here. I am this outreach coordinator for Prince William Sound Regional Citizens Advisory Council, and we are a group that was formed after the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989 to represent the citizens of the communities impacted by the spill. We provide a voice for citizens affected by decisions related to the Alyeska pipeline terminal and the tankers that use it. Our mission is citizens promoting the environmentally safe operation of the Alyeska terminal and associated tankers. And this, sorry, I'm running 2 slides here. So if there's a delay on my end, that's just me trying to get to my notes. So we have board members who represent all of the communities and user groups of the region. You can see this map is showing the extent of the spread of the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and the communities that are listed are part of our board, part of the Citizens Advisory Council. We also have technical committees. These are volunteer citizens who have a particular interest or special expertise. For example, it might be maritime operations or petroleum transport, marine toxicology, and so forth. What do? We do environmental monitoring of the spill region. We provide oversight of the terminal and the tankers. They have oversight of their plans for prevention and response, as well as oversight of their actual drills and trainings out on the water. We make recommendations to both industry and regulators, so our government, about best practices, and we educate and inform the public about the current practices. So a little bit of context. So just to put us all into the same page here, this red line is the 810-mile pipeline that brings oil from the North Slope down to Valdez, where it goes to the Valdez Marine Terminal, or you may hear me call it VMT, where it gets loaded up onto a tanker. So this is a tanker. At the end, you can see this scaffolding looking stuff is actually the pipeline coming out of the VMT, loading crude oil up onto this tanker. Oh, I'm so sorry. Let me fix that for you. Now you can see the tanker. There you go. This is a 941-foot long tanker. This is pretty standard size. To give you some comparison, that's about 3 football fields, massive ships. And then the tankers exit from the marine terminal and they follow more or less this red line out through Prince William Sound, out Hinchinbrook Entrance, out into the Gulf of Alaska, and then most of them go to refineries along the West Coast in Washington and California. Occasionally, we'll have a tanker that takes crude oil over to Asia to be refined. Now, in today's talk, I'm going to be speaking about what do we do once oil has spilled? How do we respond to an oil spill? And when I say me, I should clarify, I don't mean RCAC, my organization. I'm referring to the entire system, and I'll explain what that system is. So this photo is the Exxon Valdez, surrounded by boom, and those little tiny dots are fishing vessels to give you a sense of scale. Again, we're looking at 3 football field long tanker. Now, when there is a spill today, and the reason I put this picture of the Exxon Valdez up is because this was a pivotal time. It's been mentioned multiple times by presenters because it really changed things for Prince William Sound, the ecosystem and the culture, and also how oil spills are planned for, to be prevented and responded to. The state of Alaska put in what's called a response planning standard after the Exxon Valdez, which is a requirement that the oil tankers in Prince William Sound must plan to have enough response personnel and equipment on scene to contain and recover 300,000 barrels of oil in 72 hours. So this is to say the first 72 hours after a spill are the most critical for containing that oil, getting it cleaned up. This was a missed window, of course, in the Exxon Valdez oil spill. They weren't ready to go. And so they missed doing effective cleanup in those first 72 hours. And then a storm came and blew the oil. And from there, it became a much bigger disaster. So today, Alyeska has a program that's called SERVS. That's an acronym for Ship Escort Response Vessel System. And this is their branch that runs spill prevention and response. And they're the folks on the hook, if you will, for the first 72 hours. They are ready at any time to respond, no matter how large or small a spill may be in the Sound, and to meet that response planning standard of being able to clean up, being prepared to clean up the oil in 72 hours. And then during this time, Unified Command is formed, and the rest of the pieces of the spill response are stood up. So Unified Command is a piece of the Incident Command System structure, or you'll hear me refer to it as ICS. And this is a system that is scalable and adaptable. It's a process for incident management. It's used in a bunch of industries, so you may have run across this in some other fields that you work in. For oil spills in Prince William Sound, the Unified Command is made up of at least 3 parties. Each is called an on-scene coordinator. We have our federal on-scene coordinator, which would be for an oil spill in the water, the Coast Guard. We have a state on-scene coordinator, which is the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation, or DEC. And then we have the RP, or responsible party, on-scene coordinator. And the responsible party is who spilled the oil. Sometimes you'll have additional members of the Unified Command. You might have a local on-scene coordinator or a tribal on-scene coordinator, depending on where the spill is and who it may be impacting. And the Incident Command System runs this process called the Planning P. And so that first, the standing leg of the P happens right at the beginning, where the spill folks get notified and geared up and brought in to begin the response. And then the top part of the P is a cycle that runs regularly, and it includes developing your priorities, assigning your tasks, creating objectives to drive the work in planning, reviewing the current status, the current needs, and then using a series of course, they have a bunch of forms, because if you jump back, let me just jump back for a sec to, whoa, hello slides. Okay, what I didn't mention under this slide is that this isn't a position for 8 people, right? I said that it was scalable. You might have hundreds of people under each of these categories to do all the work. So these folks fill out different forms to move the information up the chain of command so that Unified Command can integrate it. And then they create an Incident Action Plan, or IAP, that describes the next operational period. So the planning goes in, they create an IAP, and then that goes out into operation, right, to implement it. At the beginning of a spill, when it's, the most intense, important time, an operational period might be 12 or 24 hours. Later on, as you're kind of at the tail end of cleanup, it might be as long as a week or longer. But for each operational period, the Unified Command goes through this process where they assess what's happening, what's needed, they create the plan, and then they implement the plan. So what are the pieces of this plan that they might consider? Well, elements of oil spill response in Prince William Sound include strategies to recover or remove the oil. We'll talk about boom in a moment. This is a photo of boom, quite a large boom coming off of what you can't quite see on the out of the frame here, is that this is one of those response barges that's part of the SERV's equipment to meet that response planning standard. And then this thing that's being dropped into it is a skimmer, which would clean up the oil. So we have strategies to recover or remove oil. We have to track and find the oil slick over time, protecting shoreline areas before oil reaches them, storing and managing recovered oil, oily water, and other wastes, managing the influx of response personnel, communications, shoreline cleanup, and protecting wildlife. So I'm going to chat about each of these pieces a little bit. So here's another type of boom. And so you can see this is similar to what we just saw, but on a much smaller scale. So boom is used, this kind of boom is actually used to scoop up oil that's on the ocean. And then here you can see this smaller scale skimmer that'll be dropped in this sort of collection pool here, where they'll actually suck up the oil off of the surface. And over here you can see a couple of smaller vessels towing the boom, and a slightly larger fishing vessel here managing the skimmer and managing the boom. And this is an example of how our fishing fleet is trained and deployed in order to help with oil spill response. We have over 400 vessels between Prince William Sound, Seward, Homer, and Kodiak, who all are regularly trained and kept on contract so that they can be called up by SERVs to help respond to an oil spill if needed. There are some non-mechanical types of recovery, or excuse me, there's mechanical recovery, and then there's some other non-recovery ways of dealing with oil. So this photo is showing a plane dropping chemical dispersant. Dispersant is a soup of chemicals that are dropped on an oil spill that breaks it up, so that instead of all being at the surface as an oil slick, it breaks into little droplets that then sink down into the water column. This is a fairly controversial technique because, of course, it doesn't get rid of the oil, it just moves it. It's a trade-off. When it's not on the surface, it protects shorelines. It's less likely to wash up on shore, but it does move into the water column, so it may be impacting the it does impact the ecosystem at those levels. We also have in situ burning. In situ just means on site, right? So you can use, this is a special kind of fireproof boom that you use to corral the oil. And instead of using something like a skimmer to get it off the water, you ignite it. And this is, again, it's not recovering the oil, it's moving the pollution from being in the water to being in the air. So Prince William Sound RCAC, we advocate for mechanical recovery of oil as the primary option, although it is very difficult. Okay, so another piece that we plan for in the planning P, in the incident action plan, is to track and find the oil slick. And this is harder than it sounds. Oil can get moved by currents, sucked under, pop back up somewhere else, and it can be quite difficult to spot. These two photos, this one here is actual oil. You can see it's being collected by boom. You can see oil has this sort of reddish color when it's crude oil, when it's spilled. Over here, this other image looks pretty similar, right? These swirls of reddish stuff. This is actually an algal bloom, not an oil spill. And there are some complex technologies and fancy cameras that include infrared, polarized cameras, thermal, something called laser fluorosensor, radar, all these different technologies and ways of taking pictures of the water to try to determine where is the oil, how big is the slick, how thick is the slick, so that that information can go into the incident action plan and help inform the response. So I'm actually going to pop into the chat here a fun link you can check out later where Noah has put together a quiz where you can go on and look at a series of photos and test your skills and see if you are able to spot the real oil or the look-alike oil. And there is a photo in there that was taken in at least one I recall that was taken in Prince William Sound. So in a place, it was fun because I looked at it and I said, oh, I camped on that beach. And I looked it up and sure enough, it was that beach. So you'll have to go and see if that was an oil spill or not. Another piece that gets integrated into the incident action plan is shoreline protection. So this is a different kind of boom. These fishing crews are setting this boom up to the shore. This would be called a nearshore task force. And they're setting up this boom to block oil from passing it. So if currents were moving from left to right, the boom would be set up to prevent it from going any farther. And where we do this is in sites that have been pre-identified as really critical or sensitive areas to protect. And these are called geographic response strategies. Each one has a pre-written up plan of what kind of equipment you would need to set up. So we have this, this is called shore seal boom. And it kind of rises and floats as the tide comes and goes so that oil can't sneak under it. And then you have this boom here, which is basically a floating fence. I haven't really described how boom is constructed. Obviously, you can see there's a floating part, and then there's a skirt, a heavier part underneath, so that as oil hits it, it can't get over to the other side. And I mentioned we have oil storage and disposal as well as waste storage and disposal. So this picture here is a mini barge. If you recall back to that fishing vessel that was right next to the boom and had the skimmer, what you couldn't see is on the other side would be something like this. It's a containment for the oil and oily water that's sucked up by the skimmer. And then, of course, they have to move this someplace else to a larger containment, and they can try to recover as much of the crude oil as they can to be usable, or they have to figure out how to dispose of it. But there's also a lot of other waste that needs to be disposed of. I've got this picture over here of all the PPE that folks might be wearing. A big change from the past is we know that this stuff is quite toxic, and so we make sure that our frontline workers are well protected. But then, of course, as this stuff gets oily, we have to do something with it. We're not just throwing it in our local town dump. It's too far. There we go. So another piece that needs to be managed is the response personnel. When we do drills, just drills for this, where we have the folks in unified command, there are sometimes hundreds of people who come from all over the world to help run all of the components of the incident command. And that doesn't even include the folks on the water who are doing the cleanup. And all of these folks are going to need food and lodging and transportation. This is an aerial photo of Valdez. So you can see the size of it. And of course, we know Whittier is much smaller. We have to think about how these small communities would handle this kind of influx between the management in the incident command, the implementers of those operations, and of course, media and other folks who may be showing up. This was a big challenge in the Exxon Valdez oil spill as these small communities dealt with an influx of folks. And if we jump back to looking at the Unified Command chart I showed earlier, we have over here some of our communications team. So the Public Information Officer, and they're in Prince William Sound, they're going to stand up something called the JIC, J-I-C, the Joint Information Center. And this is the team whose job it is to provide accurate information to the public, including the media. And then we also have our liaison officer. And the liaison officer's job and their team is to connect with the communities who are most at risk or most likely to be impacted. Now, we have a special thing here in Alaska under the liaison officer, which is called the Regional Stakeholder Committee, or the RSC. The RSC is a group of individuals or stakeholders who are invited to share their local knowledge with Unified Command. RSC members present issues of local concern and also help identify local resources that could be useful to the response. It's a small part of the overall spill response mechanism, but it's a very important part because it can really help bridge between the response and the affected communities or landowners. And the RSC is named in the formal government response plans for oil spills in Alaska at both the Alaska Regional Contingency Plan and more locally in our Prince William Sound Area Contingency Plan. All right, another piece of operations is if oil gets to land, we need to do shoreline cleanup. Shoreline cleanup is difficult to ineffective, but we give it a shot. I've got two photos here. This is from the 1989 cleanup effort. And infamously, you likely know that a lot of their shoreline cleanup used these high pressure, hot water to attempt to blast the oil out of the rocks. And it, as I said, infamously was more detrimental to the environment than was anticipated. The hot water destroyed the intertidal microorganisms and also pushed the oil deep into the substrate. So it's not a technique that is used anymore. What I have over here in this other photo is a modern technique of a cold water deluge system. So what they do is they set up this perforated tube, like some of you may have seen to water your garden, and then they pump cold seawater up so that it lands on the beach and trickles down, and so that any oil that might have landed on the beach theoretically would get floated up and flushed down to sea. And then they have this boom set up so that it would corral, and then they can skim up any oil that's recovered off the beach that way. So that's an example of a change from old to a more modern technique. Another piece of that operations is wildlife control. This can include, of course, recovery and cleanup. These are both photos from Exxon Valdez era. And over here you have these whales coming into this oiled area. And so before recovery and cleanup, they may at times do hazing, where they'll try to keep animals from entering the area, and also simple observation, just noticing, someone needs to be noticing whether marine or bird life is coming towards the spill area. So that's all a piece of the operations plan as well. So that comes to the end here. Just a quick review. We covered Unified Command and how that's structured and how that integrates with the Alyeska SERVS program for the first 72 hours. I may not have mentioned, as I'm reviewing it in my mind, that after those 72 hours, that's when the responsible party, the spiller of the oil, takes over for the role that SERVS had been playing. We covered ICS, the Incident Command System, and the Planning P, and how that planning and assessment gets turned into operations. And then we covered briefly the many elements to consider while planning oil spill response. And I've got a couple of, all right, we're going to try to multitask here. All right. I have got a couple of websites to share with you. I'm going to put them in the chat. One is some more information. We've just finished a project here at RCAC about the Regional Stakeholders Committee, where we created some materials to support communities or someone who might be called up to participate in that to get educated and informed. So if you're interested in learning more about the RSC, there's a link to that. And more specifically, this is part of those materials. But in this toolkit, the second link I just posted, there are a number of a little bit more information about what I just shared here, the kind of oil spill 050 kind of information. So feel free to dive in there if you would like to get a little more of this information. And this is what we do as Prince William Sound RCAC, is we educate and inform our communities, and we represent you folks, the regional citizens, into this process. And let me just post my email. Whoops, that's not my email.
Hey, Betsy, we've got about 4 minutes left, and we also have 2 questions for you in the Ask a Question box.
Great. I'm ready for them. Are the oil tankers owned by Alyeska or someone else? They are owned by someone else. So the oil is all owned by the operators, right? So who pulls it out of the ground in the North Slope. Alyeska, and then they form Alyeska as a consortium in order to move it all down to Valdez. And then each oil owner has a contracted shipper as well. So it gets a little complicated because there's a lot of players, but the short answer is Alyeska does not own the tankers themselves. And then Betsy, how often are spill response teams training? Great question. There's a lot of layers of spill response. The fishing fleet gets trained once per year. There's a annual training in each of those hub communities. And then, you know, there's folks who work for the industry who training is a part of their much more regular work plan. There are drills and exercises that happen throughout the year. And then there's like a major drill, which is done once per year, but because there's the 4 different owners of Alyeska, they rotate through who's doing a major drill each year. So there's a lot of different pieces based on that. Cool. William, were there any other questions there for me that I'm not seeing? Or Paul?
I think that's all we have for now, Betsy. Thank you.
Well, thanks everyone. Glad to be here. And again, I put my, I don't know if I'm mirror imaged here or not, but I did put my email into the chat. So if you're interested in learning more about anything I shared, or anything about how to get yourself involved or your community more involved in engaging with this system to make sure it really stays robust, you know, our perspective is those of us who live and work and play here and subsist here are the ones who are most impacted if and when there is a spill. And so it's very important for us to stay educated and to have a voice in making sure that this whole system of prevention, response, preparedness stays strong and robust. So thank you very much, everyone.